Chuck. Unique New York. Unique New York. The aardvark has oddly shaped feet.
All right, Kristin, go ahead. Check. What'd you say?
The aardvark has oddly shaped feet. Talk is as loud as like you're gonna talk.
Talk as loud as I'm gonna talk.
Ooh, you got a nice, good, deeper-ish voice for radio.
I got a decent. It's all the theater training.
Are you gonna have to be my season 2?
I could be.
That could be fun.
I
like the plaid, by the way.
Thanks.
So we do this thing now where we in the beginning of the podcast we like just record the raw like beginning, and as long as I don't say something stupid,
I know. I always feel like how do you
start?
When do you start? I did that. Like I was on Charlie Barron's podcast recently.
Yeah,
and like we're friendly or friends. Like we have one very good mutual friend, and so we were like shooting the shit about him.
Sure.
And I was like, have we started yet? Like.
Yeah.
And he's like, no, I'll cut this part out. I was like,
you always do this stuff where like you yap about how was your Thanksgiving, and it's like it can date the show. And so if you pick up a podcast 3 months, 6 months later, and all of a sudden you hear him yapping about Christmas or Thanksgiving or some event that's passed, you might shut it off real quick.
Would you shut it off for that reason?
I would, but I have a very, very short attention span.
Because I would say what I find with comedy, like I forgot whose comedian, what comedian it was, but I remember it was a Netflix special, and I like the comedian a lot. I don't know if it was Bill Burr. I don't think it was Bill Burr, but it was. But I watched it in like 2018, and the special had come out in early 2017, and all of it was politics. And so all the jokes were super dated. I mean, this was like the very beginning of all the Trump stuff.
Sure.
And so it was just not that funny. Because it was just like...
Is that your official
well, no,
Yelp
I think
review?
It's just... I mean, this is why, because like I've done stand-up. Like,
you've done stand-up?
Oh, yeah.
Oh.
So like
boy.
My short version of the many lives I've lived. So grew up in Madison, moved to LA when I was 16 to be an actress.
Okay.
I had an agent, had a manager. Thought that's what I wanted to do. By the time I was 20, I was like, I should go to college.
Yeah.
I had success. Like I still get like 37-cent residual checks.
You can retire on that in some other countries.
And I think I got one when I was just home because I still have the SAG checks go to my parents' house. And it was like, I was on an episode of Without a Trace, and they still play overseas. So it was like 30 line items of how many times it's played over like the last year. And each one was for like less than $1. It added up to like $11.26.
That stuff is so interesting.
Get a cocktail, maybe a beer, maybe not even a cocktail, maybe just a beer. But anyway, so then I started going to college, transferred to UC Berkeley. There I was doing, like, that's where I really got more into politics and public policy and everything. But then when I graduated, I was living in the Bay Area. So then I worked in tech.
Wow.
And then I moved to New York.
You got a story.
With that tech company in end of 2016. So Trump had gotten elected. I was out of the tech bubble of San Francisco, and I was living in Brooklyn, but New York. And very quickly, I was like, I don't want to sell software for the rest of my life. Like, there's so many other things I'm interested in, and technology is not
one of them.
One of them. And so I quit kind of without a plan. But in the meantime, I had started performing again. And so I was doing sketch, improv, and stand up. And then that's when I started to teach myself how to do the videos.
Yeah.
And so circa 2017, 2018, I was getting up like fairly regularly. Like I wasn't getting paid. It was like all like free open mics and like just asking for like friends who had shows in the back of bar basements and stuff like that.
Nothing wrong with that.
But did stand up and then made the decision basically like feeling like you either had to really double down on stand up or I had to really double down on the videos because they're very different. So this brings me full circle to the point that I wanted to make in that like with stand up, it's your job to make people laugh like every 15 to 30 seconds, right? And with politics, like you have to be a really, really good stand-up to pull that off, right? Like most of the really good comedy it's always super relatable.
Yeah.
You think of Ali Wong and doing both of hers,
I love
like
her,
pregnant,
Baby Cobra.
Right? And all like one of my friends who's a mom, when she did her second one, talking about having her first kid, they were like, "This is so true."
Yes, that I've watched. Is it Baby Cobra, the first one?
I think Baby Cobra's the first.
I've watched that probably. I wouldn't be an exaggeration, a dozen times.
Yeah, she's so funny. I forgot what the second one was, but she did the second one, and she was just fully pregnant with her second child.
Yeah. I trapped his ass. Well, before we get too far into this, episode 20, Said No One Ever podcast. Kristin Brey, is that how you say it?
No, it's Kristin Brey.
Brey.
It's a trick question. Because when you read it, It absolutely looks like Brey.
I tried stalking you as much as I could to figure out how to pronounce it, so I didn't have
You
to
gotta
ask
just
it because
listen to
we've like
Steve's
hung out
show.
before, and I know, but I have a terrible memory.
No, it's fine.
Welcome to the show. Why don't you tell? Well, you already told everybody who you are. You are the face of As Wisconsin Goes.
As Goes Wisconsin.
As Goes Wisconsin, which is you have a TikTok. You post them on Instagram. Do you do them for like the Journal Sentinel, or is it part of it?
Yeah. So basically, As Goes Wisconsin started last year as a get out the vote digital social media campaign, and because it was basically. I got stuck back in Wisconsin. I was living in Los Angeles, got stuck here during COVID, started making these videos. And I think largely because last year all the organizers who were getting out the vote had to switch to everything that was digital instead of knocking doors.
Yeah.
And so there was a huge opportunity to make some funny political content. And so going into this year, which was an off year for elections, it turned to doing kind of just some news, some Wisconsin history, some kind of like just a spattering of a lot of different things.
Sure.
The central theme being Wisconsin and trying to inform people, but with also make them laugh. And so, yeah, so it's all online. It's asgoeswisconsin.com is the website where we'll post blogs. But for the most part, it's like short videos that are under 60 seconds. Sometimes they're explainers. Sometimes they're just jokes. Sometimes it's like the classic TikTok lip syncing to a funny sound.
Any dancing? You doing dancing?
I don't do any of the choreographed dances. I just look like an idiot.
There's
like,
nothing right now that triggers me more than TikTok dances.
What
in
about
particular, when I see commercials for like Target or a gas station, and there's like a family all dressed in the same plaid pajamas, like doing a TikTok dance. I don't know why, but my God, it triggers me in a way that very few things do. It drives me insane.
That's fair.
I don't know why. I have no justification for it. It just, boy, I hate it. I dislike it very, very much.
That's fine. I mean, I think if someone can really dance, it's fun to watch.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm not really much on the dance trends.
Okay.
But then, in addition to As Goes Wisconsin, about October-ish, I'm the first video columnist for the Journal Sentinel. And so under the Ideas Lab, which kind of took the place of their editorial column or editorial board, we're doing short videos. They started their own TikTok. So there's one producer there who's doing like straight news,
sure, and
trying to figure out different things that would resonate on their TikTok. Just like the first, like she was like documenting the Kyle Rittenhouse case with a much more broadcast, this is the news tone.
Sure.
And then I kind of come in there with still fact checked and informational, but a little bit more tood and comedic delivery. And so we did 9 off the bat that were all about redistricting and gerrymandering.
Okay.
And then we've done one about public opinion polling. We've done one about the election investigation, the ongoing election investigations
I bet that
in
was
Wisconsin.
Fun.
And then
nothing in the comments.
Oh, there's always stuff in the comments. I just don't read. At least on Journal Sentinel, I don't read the comments because I'm not responsible for responding to them. Like on my own, I have enough to deal with. Like people, I actually don't get trolled that badly on my channels.
God, I do.
Not, what? It was crazy because so the poor young woman who's the producer who was doing all the Kyle Rittenhouse stuff for Journal Sentinel and who was literally just stating the facts of what happened with no opinion.
Mm-hmm.
She got like targeted on her private accounts. And
so
in 4 years of putting myself on the internet, I've never had anyone threaten me. I've never had anything that made me scared.
Imagine. And as someone who I've made probably over 300 vlogs, I do Instagram stories every day. I mean, I'm very open with my life. And I am surprised that no one has. I've never had to deal with something like that. I couldn't imagine what it would be like to have to be. You see nurses now, people who are like anti-vaccine or think COVID is fake, going after nurses, and you're seeing teachers being gone after, and people in healthcare, school board, and it's just I couldn't imagine. Having to deal with something that you did not sign up for, let alone putting yourself out there on the internet and having to deal with that.
I mean, I think it's like there's those of us who choose. I think that's what people
exactly.
It's like I have pretty thick skin. I am
sure.
I choose to put myself on the internet. I know what that comes with that, but I also don't think I've gotten it. I've not dealt with the same wrath that I think other, specifically women on the internet have, which I'm thankful for. And maybe that means I'm just not famous enough yet. But
well, today's episode, boy, we're gonna flip this 180 degrees.
I know that's
today's
what I'm
episode
about.
is called "Hot or Not." And that is in reference to the website that I met my wife on, hotornot.com, back in 2008. Very classy site. You would rate people like 1 to 10, and then you could like slide into their DMs and message them and stuff.
So this was pre-Tinder?
Way pre-Tinder. I mean, this is like AIM, Netscape Navigator sort of shit.
Wow.
Yeah, it was pretty cool.
What was the other one? So there's obviously Match, but what was the one that they also Cupid?
Oh yeah, OK Cupid.
OK Cupid.
There's Christian Mingle. I mean, there's
the great
a
thing about OK Cupid, because they had an entire like incubator or like separate part of their company that was just looking at like data, and so they had entire like theories and conclusions based on like dating patterns.
Sure.
And so they were using the data for good to like make conclusions about
but you don't
men
see that
and women.
often.
And it was cool. I mean, it was really cool. I don't think the company is even around anymore.
Interesting.
Tinder kind of disrupted that whole game.
This whole episode is about human relationships, sex, companionship, and what are the sorts of things that make human beings so inherently different than basically every other species on planet Earth. And so I want to get into some really, really fascinating topics here, because I think whether you're a man, a woman, gay, straight, trans, somewhere in between, I think the one thing we all have in common is that we are all attracted to vastly different people. And I want to get into why aren't human beings monogamous for the most part? Kind of get into why are we all attracted to different sorts of people? Why are some women attracted to men with deep voices and beards and they want to chop wood and work on cars, and other women are attracted to guys in a suit and tie and drive a Tesla? And why are some men attracted to supermodels and stay-at-home moms, and other men are attracted to entrepreneur women and feminists and stuff like that? And so I really want to get into a lot of the nuances of human relationships and sexuality and all that stuff. And I think this is going to be a really fascinating conversation, because when we first met in person at #MKE a few months ago, we started like getting into this pretty deep, and I was super.
I don't know how we brought it up. Well, because the reason I've always been interested, so like the class that I took in college that was kind of my major, but kind of outside of it, but was like the most interesting class that I took, was the evolution of human sexuality.
Yes.
And it's, largely a cultural anthropological class that the professor had. His name's Malcolm Potts. He had like studied over hundreds of cultures over 100 different countries, kind of in the search of like what as humans and like our DNA or our hormones or our genes like drive our behavior.
Sure.
And it was the amount of things that stuck with me in that class. And this was like 11 years ago.
Oh, wow.
Like certain things just still stick with me from that class that like from my economics class definitely don't. And so the biggest one that always stuck with me was this monogamy thing.
It's fascinating.
Because like you said, so like there's certain things as humans that we don't do compared to other mammals. So like biggest one, like human women don't have physical signs that we're ovulating.
Yeah.
Whereas like almost every other mammal
birds
does.
are flying around chirping.
Yeah.
What also is fascinating, not to get too off topic, is just the whole mating ritual. Like most in like the animal kingdom, most animals, like the pretty ones, are the men trying to attract like birds and.
But it's also that is typically in. So this comes back to the why.
I like how I said men. I called an animal a men.
Why it makes no sense. So basically the in species there's this idea of like sexually dimorphism. So where the men are either the males and the females are the same size, or the men are bigger. So in most mammals, and a lot of mammals, so we think gorillas, we think lions, and we think humans, the men are on average bigger than women.
Sure.
But then there's like marmosets and maybe bonobos. But there's a couple, then there's some mammals where they're the same size.
Okay.
So in the species that are the same size, monogamy is the mating pattern. And so they mate for life, and there's equal competition of males trying to attract females, and females compete with each other to attract males. And so, but the standard is that there is 2 pairs. Versus in every other species that's sexually dimorphic besides humans, it is polygyny.
Yeah.
And so there is, you think of like gorillas and harems, and you think of like the one lion with all the lionesses and stuff. And most of the family units in those mammals are the mother and her offspring, and the father's not around. He's like just there to like impregnate, and then he's like,
and then
peace
boom,
out, bro.
bounces.
But humans, like we try this monogamy thing, and I think it's so interesting because most, like, if we were actually truly meant to be monogamous, we'd be the same size. And so, but you see it in so many of our patterns of like how men compete with each other for the attention of women and all of these different things. And yet, like, from this class, the biggest thing that we took away was like the reason why we attempt, like the evolutionary reason that we attempt to do monogamy is basically the infertile sex of like having sex not to get pregnant.
Sure.
Which is why women don't show that they're ovulating.
Sure.
So it's like the bond and the attachment that having sex creates keeps a couple together. In order, because of how long as we like give birth to these like very helpless babies and that like it takes, in order for your offspring to survive and your genes to go on, like it's better to have two parents.
Yeah.
And so that's just like blows my mind.
Well, I mean, it's fascinating. And, I think, getting to the first question I wanted to ask, what is it about human beings that separates us from every other animal? Like, as you said, human beings are inherently monogamous. I think it is companionship, it's balance, it's family legacy. I think it's everything that doesn't involve reproduction and sex. I think that companionship is the one thing that separates human beings from every other species. Like, most people don't want to be alone, aside from, I don't know, people that like hiding out in their parents' basement. But I think people really, they value companionship. They want to grow old with somebody. And I think with human beings, I think that is, at some point in your relationship, that becomes just as important or more important than the whole physical sexual attraction, which is probably the reason why you first hooked up with somebody in the first place. And I don't think we really see that with a lot of other animals. They just do their thing.
I don't know. Lobsters mate for life.
Do they?
Their lives aren't as long as
Emperor
ours,
penguins, they're monogamous for like, I think they're one mating season.
Is it just one mating season?
Yeah. And
like,
then
there's
like
definitely some that mate for life.
Is there?
But I don't know if they have the same frontal lobe capacity that it's because how they're wired to do it versus like the desire for companionship.
Sure.
But we're absolutely social creatures, right? Like, which makes sense. Again, going to evolution, like if you think about us versus like one-on-one, us versus a predator, most of those predators are gonna kill us. But as a group, we can kill a buffalo or we can kill a lion.
Hunt them
like
to
it's
extinction.
like for our own survival, which is why like there's certain. It's why we have like a guilt thing in our brain, right? Or like clue into like social norms because like we want to be accepted, because acceptance in our most like primal lizard brain is survival.
Exactly. And who's going to give you the most acceptance aside from your parents and brothers and sisters and very close family? Yeah. If you're lucky, it's going to be that significant other. I've always said my wife it's the one person you can count on to be there for you for the rest of your life. And that notion, that mantra, that ethos, I think is more powerful and drives more people than like fucking for the rest of their life, Which is interesting, but then we also, a lot of people think that, but not everyone always gets that. No.
Or gets it on
Hence
the first
why there's
try.
divorce. And
and like that was the thing. It was like the interesting thing of like serial monogamy being different than monogamy. Monogamy being literally like scientifically like one mate. Yeah. Versus serial monogamy being like we pair off
decade chunks,
but then we might pair off with someone else.
Sure.
And so like that's like our attempt as like a sexually dimorphic species to actually try.
Why do you think some people are so successful at being monogamous? And you always hear, you go to the 40th and 50th and 60th wedding anniversaries for grandparents and aunts and uncles, and then you see other people who they get married and then like 6 months later we're getting divorced. Why do you think some people just are unable to be in a monogamous relationship? Like why do so many people fail where other people succeed, in your opinion?
I think this is a multi-part question.
That's a big
multi-part answer. So I think one is generational, right? Like you have to remember that women weren't allowed to have their own bank account or credit card until like the 70s.
Right.
And so the amount of 50, 60 year marriages where, for not all, But some women were just trapped because that was like...
I would say most.
Yeah, like they didn't have... If it was abuse, whether it was emotionally or physically abusive relationship, or whether they were in love with them or not.
Or just basic financial and emotional dependence, you know?
And so I think the rise of divorce is also in line with the rise of like female independence. Of being like, I'm not going to put up with this anymore. Which is different than... people who just get married too soon or get married for the wrong reasons. Or I think it's been interesting moving back to Wisconsin after spending my entire adult life until last year, either in California or New York.
Okay. Were you born and bred in Wisconsin?
Yeah, I was born in Madison.
Okay.
And how many people in Wisconsin are divorced?
It's a lot.
Like how many people so I'm 35.
Sure.
My fiance, this will be his second marriage. He got married and divorced.
Okay.
His sister got married and divorced. Granted, she was living in Arizona, but she's from Wisconsin. I have so many friends in their 30s who got married in their 20s.
Me too.
And are divorced now. Versus,
I know more people that were married and divorced than are still married right now.
That's wild. But so, and like versus my friends who got married later in California and New York.
Yeah.
That I know of my friends out there, there's far fewer divorces. And I think that like there's something about Midwest, maybe not, it's just like, and this is a stereotype, so people might not agree, but like there's just more pressure to like, well, this is what you do.
Yeah.
Like you
meet someone, you get married, you get a house with a white picket fence, you go to college, you have
kids and like
3 kids, and then
it's like before you even like I think about how much I've changed, not only from 25 to 35, but even 30 to 35.
Oh, absolutely.
Of like how much more mature. Like I only just now feel mature enough that I am the best version of myself in my relationship. Like I look back at past relationships, and granted, some of the guys were not always great either, but like my emotional volatility, the stuff that I did that was manipulative, that like put my feelings first, and like not really understanding the full range of like don't let your feelings control you. And like,
I mean, it's astonishing. Most people nowadays are getting married in their late 20s and early 30s. And that's kind of the norm. When I look back at like my mom's generation, my grandparents' generation, my grandma was married at like 17 or 18. My mom was engaged at 17. And it's like, I couldn't imagine.
It's babies having babies.
Yeah. Like being the headspace I was in at that age. I honestly, I don't think, and not a knock on people that have done it, I don't think you should get married before you're like 27, 28.
I mean, I agree with you. And it's like, if you do it, and I mean, I definitely know
unless you lived a really fast, hard life
just...
and like you learned a lot. I just don't think the average person is.
But even if you do, I think there's also making the room that like it may not be forever.
Yeah.
Right? Because it's like you may change and you may not change together. And that I think this expectation that it needs to be a 50 or 60 year marriage is just not culturally viable anymore, because I think there's just too many options. There's too many. I think that we've like on like Maslow's hierarchy, especially in the States, like we've reached a point where like happiness and like self-determination and certain like luxuries of like absolute like our sustenance and like our actual survival mode, like we can like think bigger than just I need this person to survive. And so it's like if you're not happy anymore, you don't have to stay.
Yeah.
And so I think that's okay, right?
Yeah. What do you think? You look at in air quotes like a general relationship 100 years ago, and you look at now. What have you seen change in society that has influenced women's roles in a relationship and men's roles in a relationship? How is a relationship from 1921? How has that changed compared to 2021? It's 2021, right?
In America?
Just in I guess in America, because I guess
that's where we live. Well, I mean, I do think that, like we said, there's a huge difference in the rise of women's rights.
Yeah.
So if we're talking 1921, ability to vote,
right?
Then ability to go to college, the ability to
own
get
property.
your own property. The limitation.
Get a divorce.
Not have your kids taken away from you. Like there was a lot of laws that allowed men to be in control, and so if you were in a bad marriage, that was just kind of too bad. And I think that is the biggest difference, right? And so it's
I agree.
And I think there's this is always, I feel like if I spend too much time on TikTok, like there's these, conservative women who assume that feminism is the corruption of like the tight family union and like the separation of stereotypical male, like men and women gender roles in a household. It's like, no, do what you want. Like that's the point of feminism is that you can do what you want.
If your desire is to be a stay-at-home mom and have kids and that's what you want to do, that's what can complete you at life, that's okay.
But a lot of people don't even have that option anymore, right? Because everything's so expensive. But like that's like my mom, even though she was a great occupational therapist, she graduated like top of her class and she was really good at what she did. And eventually she stopped and her main thing was raising my brother and I, but then she also was volunteering for everything. But like that is an okay thing to do if you can do it, right? I mean, there's a lot of studies that show like the most successful and like rich men in, we'll say the country, but probably the world, almost all have stay-at-home wives. But if you think about it, that also makes a lot of sense because if you have someone who's staying home, so like that division of labor is like you have someone who's raising your children, you have someone who's doing your laundry, you have someone who's doing your cooking. So it's like there's a bunch of things in your life so you could to solely focus on work and double down on your own success. Yeah. Because a whole bunch of other things that like are mandatory to like live a life are being taken care of by someone else. And so you imagine like two working couples and you're both trying to juggle both.
Well, your kids are raised by maids. I always find it so fascinating how a typical male-female relationship has changed because, like, for me, what I'm attracted to, like, my wife is huge feminist. She's very independent. She's choosing to be with me. She doesn't need me. She's an entrepreneur. She works hard. She's career-driven. And those are the sort of characteristics that would, in 1950, a man would be like, absolutely fucking not, And for me, like what typically men have liked or been attracted to is just a damsel in distress and, this a stay-at-home, like back in 1950,
I don't know. It'd be interesting.
That's not attractive to me.
I feel like that's a stereotype we get fed. And I wonder how often that was true.
Yeah.
And I also think
that's an interesting
you know what I mean?
point.
Like I think it'd be interesting to think, and also this is not meant to set, if it comes off as elitist, it's not meant to. But if you think even today, like there is college educated people with masters, people who like their entire job is just to think about stuff.
Shit, and be smart.
And then there's still people who don't finish high school or work in manufacturing or like labor intensive jobs. And so I do think that there is something to be said of like with your person who is your companion wanting to match your intellect or at least be able to keep up because it just feels like the power dynamic could easily be off otherwise.
Oh, absolutely.
So I feel like that had to exist for some, like, right? There had to be, in the 50s, there were still like men who were doctorates and they fell in love with women who were hard to handle or
exactly.
The stereotype of like the whippersnapper or whatever.
Yeah.
But I think it's hard to say if that was the
Mae
I think
Wests
there's probably
of the
a
world.
lot of men still today who would prefer someone who just, I don't want to say caters to them, but is.
Oh, I think that's would be the correct phrase. It's just fascinating how everybody's attracted to different people. You even look at like I think about all of my gay and lesbian friends and family members and how different even those relationships are. Like my sister's wife. My sister is a very like feminine woman, and that's what my sister's wife is attracted to. I have other friends who are lesbians where it's like it's a very butch female and they're attracted to another very butch female. Mm-hmm. And so it's just like no matter if you're straight, gay, trans, whatever, it's like when you walk into Total Wine and like everybody's going for different brands of vodka and wine and stuff like that. It's just astonishing how different we all approach like what is attractive to us. I don't know. I just find it so fascinating.
And it's interesting because I was like rereading. There was that book, and then there was another book called Do Gentlemen Really Prefer Blondes, which is similar in that it looks at all these different studies of why we do the things we do. And in reality, like because there is still this ongoing studies and stuff going on, like what if there's a gene that makes you gay or whatever that is. And like what the good point that they made though is like it's obviously not hereditary, because if it was, it would go like that gene would go extinct. Right. Like if you were someone who was gay and you could, I guess for a lot of time people were closeted and they were still had and now we have science, so that's not totally true. But as far as like the idea that that it's not a mixture of nature versus nurture, and I think that is behind everything, right? There is fundamental biology of what we as humans are hardwired to do, and to how that influences our behavior. But then there's all of this cultural stuff that is put on top, and how our parents, not even just the cultural stuff, but then like
the pressures
the
and
stuff with the family and like
religion.
Stuff that, like totally. And there's so many other things that influence that probably also shapes who we're attracted to. I don't know if it shapes our, I don't know enough to have insight on like what shapes sexuality and sexual orientation, but at least the type of people we are attracted to. It's obviously some combination of nature and nurture.
Oh, I agree. Staying on that topic of, kind of what's built in our DNA, is it okay to judge people for sort of playing into some of the stereotypical gender roles? Like how many of the, you always hear about how like, a couple has a baby and then like the mom, like takes care of it and all that stuff like that. How much of that is just like built into the DNA, and how much of it is just bullshit? And, like it's an equal playing ground. Men can take care of the baby, and, men can cook and all that shit. How much of that is built in our DNA, do you think? And how much of it is influenced by society and just, for centuries, how human beings have kind of had that hierarchy?
Well, I think there's a very real, as long as we're talking about evolution, like there's a very real, if you are having a biological child, an uneven distribution of energy on the woman, right? Like if you're having a biological child, you have to carry the baby. You're the one who breastfeeds the baby. And in general, like I think like the serotonin, like the chemicals that connect you with your child are very strong. Like I've had male friends who've had their first kid, and like in the first year they're like, I wish I could help more, but there's just like not a lot I can do. Like she's the one who's breastfeeding. Like I just kind of, I can like get up, like I can stay up with
turn on Netflix.
But, and so like I think all of my friends who are working moms struggle. Right? Like they just struggle because they want a career and they don't want to give up. And going back to that, some of them also need to keep working. But the that desire to be home with your kid doesn't go away. Yeah. And so I think there is some part of the natural, what do you ever want to call it, DNA biology of like why the gender, the stereotypes still happen, right? Yeah. Like there's like an obvious, what we're seeing in the labor shortage and how many women have not gone back to work. Part of that is because of how expensive daycare is. Some of that's because they can't find a job that, pays enough for childcare, et cetera, et cetera. But like that need, I think the female need to want to be with your child is a very natural thing. But there's also couples who like, that's like, she's a higher weight, like she makes more money.
It's completely flipped.
And it's completely flips. And that's what works best for the family. So it's like, I don't think to judge anyone on what works best for their family, it's any of our places. Yeah. Right. Like, right. It's just like, this is the whole point of like self-determination and like, you do you. Like, I don't know your life. Yeah. That's what I think.
Right. I always find those, those gender role dynamics fascinating, especially when I look at like me and my wife's relationship, because like she makes more money than me. She's the one that like wants to build things, and like I'm the one that like cooks and cleans. And I have I'm a very, in air quotes, feminine man, I guess you would call it, which I'm totally fine with. I don't care. Which is weird because I worked on cars for 20 years, and she's a very like. Masculine's not the word, but she does. She takes on a lot of the roles that like typically like I don't know, you would think a traditional man would do, and I just find those dynamics and those sort of like that sexual dichotomy very, very fascinating, and why it's so different for everybody,
Totally. I mean,
where other species are so very binary,
and I feel like there's certainly like any of the studies as I was rereading these books in preparation for today, like it's obviously like the pattern or the majority, but like the idea that there's not externalities to any of those is like, of course, everyone has their own concept or the way they interpret it or whatever. But like, there is certain things that are like, just statistically, study after study, there's certain like 3-dimensional things that men are better at. Like when you flip, you look at a block or like a 3-dimensional figure and you flip it a certain way, men are just statistically better at figuring out how to match those two things up versus like relational objects. If you find like a memory match of like where are these things next to these things, women are better at that. Like
really?
There's actual things that our brains do differently.
That stuff is so fascinating.
Like the interconnection between our left and the right side of the brain for women is much more connected than for men.
Really?
That's why men are better at doing like one thing at a time.
Oh, that is 100% me.
Versus women who can
multitask.
Yeah,
multitasking is not a word in my LinkedIn profile.
And so it's like there are certain things that have just been proven study after study that like on average men do better and then women do better. Not to say that the women and men don't exist that are better than. It's not that there's not women who are faster than most men, right? That's a real thing, or smarter than most men because they're just a genius.
Yeah.
It's just certain things. But it makes sense though, because as a species, we have to be codependent on each other, right? And so, like, there is things that are built in to be complementary rather than one being better than the other.
Yeah.
Like one gender being, or one sex being better than the other.
Exactly. Getting back to, the reproduction and sort of, the evolution of the human race, why is it, do you think, human beings are reproducing less now compared to decades and centuries past?
Again, multi-part answer. The first, I think,
because we've seen a huge decline in human reproduction, not just in the United States, but all around the world.
So if you think about it, it's one, survival rates are higher. So before, the likelihood of you living past 18 was not great.
Oh, but the life expectancy of a man in fucking 1910 was like 38.
Yeah, and so childhood deaths were very common because before we had vaccines. I mean, as much as we want to complain about,
even in the United States, infant death is one of the highest in the world.
Well, yeah, that's a different topic. But for a long time, I think people were having a lot of kids. One, because you didn't know how many would survive. Two, it was still when we were still a very agricultural society. Your kids worked the farm. Like your kids were the ones,
you needed them for labor.
Yes, you literally needed them.
That
for labor.
That sounds terrible, but I mean it's true.
And so we advanced as far as industrial revolution, and people moved to cities or whatever, and then birth control and contraceptive. And so once you didn't have to have as many kids, and then vaccines, and so fewer kids were living to adulthood, so you didn't have to replace them or whatever.
Yeah.
So I think that's the long view of us versus 100, 200 years ago, why people have less kids. Then in the very recent present times, I think it goes back to what we said. It's kids are expensive.
They are. I mean, it's a lot of money. Nowadays you need two parents for the most part to raise a kid. I mean, unless you're making bank.
We're the only country in the developed world that doesn't have paid leave, that doesn't have some kind of form of help. You're basically on your own from 0 to 5. Once they first grade, the government, you can send them to public school. You have to send it to public school. You don't even have an option. You have to, at 6, you have to send them somewhere. But until then,
those first 5 years,
you are on your own. And it's why do we think that people are I'm not in the financial place to do that, or once I finally am and I'm in my mid to late 30s, it's a lot harder to get pregnant.
It is, and there's a lot of risks associated with it.
Geriatric, that's going to be me in a couple of years, right? That geriatric pregnancy.
Well, there's that woman. She's 50 years old. She just gave birth.
Ooh, I don't know if I'd want to do that.
Do you think we'll ever get to a point where human beings will have to be incentivized to reproduce, to populate the earth? Do you ever think we'll start going?
Well, it kind of feels
because there's a lot of
with the war on abortion right now. It feels like they're kind of using the stick rather than the carrot. But
because you look at it and forget just the continuation of the human race. There's a lot of financial repercussions to human beings not procreating, especially in this country. Social Security, Medicare,
our army,
at some point, we're already
this military that we spend most of our money on. If we continue to just have a shrinking,
our generation
young
ain't gonna be able to pay for it.
Like that's a social, like that's a security issue, right? As far as like the
financial stability of the country is dependent on the future generations and there being enough people to take care of the previous generations. And if there's a financial imbalance there where like there is now where we're paying for all the boomers who are retired and need Social Security and Medicare and all that,
it's a ton of there's a great book called 1 Billion Americans by Matt Iglesias, who is like he did The Weeds on Vox, and some people don't like him, but he's like a big policy wonk. And he made this argument in this book of like why America should prioritize trying to get to 1 billion Americans. And it's for a bunch of reasons, like to compete with India, to compete with China, but also all these things of like it
why though? So we can make cheap phones and why do we need that many people?
It's all the things we're talking about, like population growth. It drives innovation, it drives competition, it drives all these different things. And like we have the size of a country that we could actually, if you look at one of those maps at night, when like the lights are on,
boy, there's a lot of open space in Utah and Nevada.
The country is not populated, right? Not because it can't be populated, it just isn't. And so like it's not that we don't have the space, which it also brings back like it's so. I try to look at things and like I definitely lean left, and I obviously do a lot of stuff with politics, and I lean left, but I largely try to look at things through, because I think a lot of times when you're talking to people who you don't agree with on like a cultural or like a value stuff, it's like, all right, what can we agree on? And I think a big thing we can agree on is the economic viability of our cities, our states, and our country. And a lot of it comes back to having enough people who can work, which we're dealing with right now, especially not only in the country, but specifically, and have been in Wisconsin.
Right.
Having people to replace you, having like a thriving, like having more people who are coming up with new ideas and stuff like that. And so when you think of it through that lens, like immigration is not such a bad thing. And like having not just like a free-for-all, but having more open arms of welcoming a population of people who want to come to this country and contribute.
Oh, absolutely.
To replace our declining birth rate.
Right.
It's a short-sighted vision to be against that, in my opinion. And
I agree.
Sometimes when you explain it in that way versus just the quote, it's the right thing to do.
Yeah.
I think people sometimes they at least soften their stance.
Oh, I agree. Immigration I think is going to be absolutely vital to the success of this country, because you're talking about not only people that are coming here that are bringing a different way of life, bringing different innovations and ideas and stuff like that, but you're talking about people that want to be here.
Yeah.
Like if you're born here, you don't have a choice. There's a lot of people in this country that don't want to be here, and
don't
appreciate what it is they have.
Yeah, and like
you always hear when someone gets elected, well, I'm moving to Canada, and it's like, no, you fucking aren't. Shut up.
I mean, that's the thing. I feel like even in the frustrating politics of Wisconsin, like I was gone for a long time. And coming back, and because we're a swing state, because our Wisconsin's state and local politics can be, especially in the last
little dicey
10 years, are dramatic. But I'm like also simultaneously like the happiest I've ever been, because it's also like I moved back and I fit back in almost immediately.
Yeah.
And I feel like it's the same thing that even when you're you're frustrated with the place that you're from on any level, whether it's your city, the state, the country. Like, it's still your home, which is why I think you think about all the countries that are struggling with way more things than we are. But when, like the refugee, any country that ever has a refugee crisis, it's like people don't want to leave their home. It's their home.
No, they don't. I mean, that's a huge deal to leave your home, leave your family, leave what little bit that you have there to go to somewhere completely different, where you don't speak the language. You're not going to get a job. Your education may not be a 1-for-1, and so. Yeah, it's frustrating when you see the way a lot of immigrants are treated.
Because it's like, I think there's just such a lack of compassion or empathy of like the desire for a better life, right? And so I was also going to think...
Which is the entire ethos of this it's on the Statue of Liberty.
But that's the thing, it's also, there's some like an insane amount of like Google... now I'm blanking, but it's basically like an insane amount of our best performing companies of the last 50 years were all founded by either immigrants or children of immigrants, right? So it's like there's tons of proof that show the like innovation and new ideas and also work ethic of new Americans that it gets really hard to argue of why we are
I know,
so
right?
mad about this, but I'd love to have a rebuttal from someone who disagrees with me.
Well, we should do another podcast on that. All right. Final question. Who has evolved more over the let's say over the last 200 years? Who's evolved more, men or women? That's a tough one.
Well, what is the criteria for
whatever you want it to be? Dealer's choice.
Evolved is a specific word.
Not evolved like biologically.
Like who has much different
whose
lives are much more different?
Like if you look at like a typical like a woman, a female in whatever 1850 and then now, and same thing with a man. Which one looks vastly different and has a vastly different life than they
women?
Did. Yeah. I would agree too.
But I think that's more because of like legal cultural changes.
Yeah.
I don't know how much.
Now here's the flip.
Like,
now here's the flip side. Is that because men have evolved more and allowed women and given them the space to get a credit card and vote? And,
I'm not sure men allowed much, considering
them.
when you think about how
women's
much
suffrage.
Yeah, it's like during like for the
I'm
vote,
just asking questions.
Women were like getting rocks thrown at them and like force fed with tubes and arrested. Right. And you know what's
astonishing during women's suffrage was there was a whole revolution in group of women who didn't want the right to vote. They didn't want independence. They were totally okay being. They had no place in politics. They had no place at conversations at the kitchen table. They had no place having a job. That's what they.
But I think this is also
that's just mind-boggling.
Do we have time to get into this?
We got 5 minutes.
All right. I think it's so interesting because to bring this full circle of talking about evolution and like a lot of women's survival mechanism is their proximity to men who can provide resources, especially in agricultural like countries, and where our belief that we don't need the resources associated with a man in order for us to survive and for our children to survive.
Sure.
And I think that is very deeply ingrained in someone. It's why in certain cultures where it's better as a woman, it's better to be married to a man who has multiple wives but a lot of resources than a poor man, right? Because ultimately in your lizard brain, there is more success at your children. Like you are willing to share someone with a lot of resources than be monogamous with someone who has less resources. And so I think in that case of like, and even, we can argue now, there is like, the reason why we always see like this, like every election cycle, that these like white women who vote for Donald Trump and the like proximity to male power is protection. And I think that also can probably explain a lot of the women who didn't want the right to vote because they just wanted to be under the protection of their fathers,
it probably
of
came
their husbands.
A lot of caveats of that independence was probably daunting and scary, and it was uncharted waters and wanted nothing to do with it. It's just fascinating.
It's fascinating.
I could talk about it all day. I just want to put an asterisk on this episode. We are by no means experts in any of this.
No, we read I reread my textbook basically from 10 years ago, and then it's a lot of opinions on top of that.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate you coming on the show. So glad to finally get you on this episode. We have to do it again sometime.
I know.
Thank you so much,
We brought
Kristin.
up so many topics.
I know, right?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.